I've been thinking about names, Alessandro said one evening as they sat in the estate's library, Elena's growing comfort with his presence having progressed to the point where shared silence felt peaceful rather than awkward. If it's a boy, which preliminary genetic testing suggests it is, I was thinking perhaps Leonardo. My grandfather's name. Though obviously you have equal say in this decision. Probably more than equal say given you're the one actually gestating him. Leonardo Romano. Elena tested the name on her tongue and found she liked how it sounded. It's good. Strong. Though I should warn you, I have absolutely no idea how to be mother. I spent 4 years being told I was inadequate at the one thing women were supposedly designed to do, and now I'm supposed to actually raise child when I've never even held baby before. That seems like recipe for spectacular failure. Then we'll fail spectacularly together, Alessandro replied with confidence that suggested he had no doubts about their combined abilities. The silk sheets that covered Elena Rossi's bed each night cost more than most people's monthly salaries, their thread count astronomical and their texture so smooth they felt like liquid luxury against skin that had long since stopped appreciating such refinements. The bedroom she occupied in the Moretti estate was decorated with the kind of understated elegance that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. Original artwork on the walls, fresh flowers replaced daily by staff who moved through the house like well-trained ghosts, furniture that had been custom designed by artisans whose waiting lists extended years into the future. It was beautiful in ways that most people could only dream of experiencing, this gilded cage where Elena had spent the past 4 years of her life serving a sentence that had no official end date, no possibility of parole, no hope of clemency from the judge who'd condemned her to this particular form of hell. Her crime, if it could be called that, had been self-defense executed with the kind of desperate violence that came from being cornered by a predator whose intentions were unmistakable. She'd been 22 years old, working as assistant to wealthy businessman whose hands had grown increasingly bold during late-night work sessions where they were alone in his office, whose suggestions had progressed from inappropriate to threatening until finally he'd simply decided that her consent was irrelevant to his desires. The attempted rape had happened in the storage room where she'd been filing documents, his body pinning hers against shelves while his hands tore at her clothing and his mouth covered her screams, and Elena had reached blindly for anything that could become weapon, finding the letter opener on nearby desk, driving it into his shoulder with enough force to make him release her, and then running while his blood followed her like accusation across the expensive carpet. He'd survived the wound, that had been confirmed by the time police arrived to question Elena about the assault her employer had reported. The story he'd told bore no resemblance to reality, painting Elena as unstable employee who'd attacked him without provocation when he'd attempted to fire her for incompetence, suggesting her violent tendencies made her dangerous to society and should be addressed through appropriate legal channels. It should have been simple matter to prove his lies. There were security cameras, there was Elena's torn clothing, there was the defensive nature of the wound she'd inflicted. But her attacker was Marco Moretti, younger son of one of the most powerful families in the region, and the Morettis had spent generations perfecting the art of making inconvenient truths disappear. The charges against Elena had been dropped within days of being filed, which should have been relief except that relief required actual freedom rather than simply different form of captivity. The Moretti family had made her an offer that was presented as mercy but revealed itself as punishment the moment she'd been naive enough to accept it. Marry Marco's older brother Dante and produce heir within reasonable time frame, and her family, who'd been arrested on fabricated charges the moment Elena had wounded Marco, would be released unharmed. Refuse, and her parents and younger siblings would spend the next decade in prison for crimes they hadn't committed, their lives destroyed by legal system that served the wealthy rather than justice. Elena had married Dante Moretti in ceremony that looked beautiful in the society pages but felt like funeral for the woman she'd been before circumstance had destroyed her autonomy. He was handsome in the cold, aristocratic way of men whose genetics had been carefully curated over generations, his features sharp and symmetrical, his body maintained through personal trainers and nutritionists who ensured he always looked like someone whose life was perfect. But his eyes when he looked at Elena held nothing except calculation, the expression of man evaluating property he'd acquired through transaction rather than choice, and his touch on their wedding night had carried none of the gentleness that intimacy should involve. "You understand the terms?" Dante had said that first night, his voice clinically detached as he'd explained what would be expected of her. "You'll live here. You'll present as my devoted wife in public. You'll attend social functions and smile appropriately and never give anyone reason to question that this marriage is anything except love match. And you'll give me son, heir to continue the Moretti name. Once you've fulfilled that obligation, once my child is born healthy and legitimate, your family will be released from custody and you'll have completed your sentence. Until then, his smile had been cold enough to make Elena shiver. You remain exactly where you are. My wife in name. My prisoner in practice. Property I own until you've given me what I purchased you to provide. 4 years. 4 years of trying and failing and being reminded with increasing cruelty that her inability to conceive made her worthless except as object lesson in what happened to women who dared to defend themselves against Moretti men. Dante's initial clinical detachment had gradually transformed into something uglier, his frustration at her continued failure to produce heir manifesting in verbal abuse that grew steadily more vicious and physical intimidation that stopped just short of leaving marks visible when she wore the expensive dresses he bought to maintain appearance of his perfect wife. You're defective, he told her last month, his voice carrying contempt that made Elena's hands shake despite her attempts to remain composed. 4 years and nothing. Most women would have given me 3 children by now. But you can't even manage the one basic biological function that justifies your existence. Your family remains in prison because you're too broken to do the one thing required to free them. How does that make you feel, Elena? Knowing that your inadequacy is why your mother cries herself to sleep every night? That your failure is why your siblings are growing up behind bars. She'd learned not to respond to his provocations, learned that defending herself only prolonged the abuse, learned that silence was survival strategy even when remaining quiet felt like suffocation. But the guilt was constant companion, the knowledge that her family suffered because her body refused to cooperate with the terms of her sentence eating at her with acidic persistence that made sleep difficult and genuine happiness impossible. What Elena didn't know, what Dante had ensured she would never discover through careful management of information and strategic isolation from anyone who might have told her the truth, was that her infertility was deliberate rather than biological failure. He'd had vasectomy performed 3 months before their wedding, the procedure conducted by private physician who understood that discretion was more valuable than ethics when treating clients whose wealth made conventional morality seem quaint. Dante had never wanted children, had never intended to fulfill his end of their bargain, had simply wanted wife he could torment indefinitely while blaming her for circumstances he'd specifically created. The control was intoxicating for him, the knowledge that Elena believed herself to be failing at task that was literally impossible giving him satisfaction that legitimate relationship never could have provided. He enjoyed watching her hope diminish month after month, enjoyed the desperation in her eyes when she'd ask if they should see fertility specialist and he'd tell her that clearly the problem was her inadequacy rather than anything requiring medical intervention. Enjoyed knowing that her family remained imprisoned because he'd decided 4 years ago that breaking Elena Rossi would be an entertaining way to spend his marriage. The truth came to Elena by accident on a Tuesday afternoon in late spring, the kind of beautiful day that made staying inside feel like crime against nature despite her having no actual freedom to go anywhere without Dante's permission. She'd been bringing him lunch, because even though they had staff who could deliver meals, Dante insisted Elena serve him personally as reminder of her subordinate position. When she'd heard voices coming from his private office. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap Elena could see her husband at his desk with his secretary Sophia positioned in his lap, the intimacy of their posture making it immediately clear that this wasn't first time they'd occupied the office together in ways that had nothing to do with work. She's still convinced she's the problem, Dante was saying, his voice holding amusement that made Elena's blood run cold. 4 years of thinking she's infertile when really I just made sure the equipment wasn't functional on my end. Best decision I ever made, that vasectomy. Means I can keep her exactly where she is forever. Desperate to produce child that's biologically impossible, guilt-ridden about her family staying in prison, completely under my control. It's perfect. You're terrible, Sophia replied, but her tone suggested admiration rather than condemnation. She has no idea? After 4 years she hasn't figured it out. Why would she? Dante's laugh was genuinely pleased with his own cleverness. Women always blame themselves first when conception doesn't happen. It's built into their psychology, they assume their bodies are failing rather than questioning whether the problem might be external. And Elena's so beaten down by now that she doesn't question anything I tell her. She's exactly what I wanted, beautiful, obedient wife who lives in constant state of failure. Much more entertaining than if she'd actually gotten pregnant and I'd had to pretend to care about child I never wanted in first place. Elena stood frozen in the hallway, the lunch tray trembling in her hands as her entire understanding of the past 4 years reorganized itself around information that made terrible, devastating sense. The fertility tests Dante had discouraged. The specialist he'd refused to consult. The increasingly vicious blame he'd directed at her for failing at task he'd ensured would be impossible. It had all been deliberate. Every moment of her suffering, Every tear she'd cried believing herself inadequate, every night she'd lain awake consumed by guilt about her family, all of it had been carefully orchestrated cruelty designed to break her spirit while maintaining appearance that he was simply frustrated husband dealing with disappointing wife. She set the tray down on the hallway table with hands that shook so badly the dishes rattled, and then she walked. Didn't run, running would have drawn attention, back to her bedroom where she locked the door and stood in the center of the beautiful cage trying to process rage and grief and bitter recognition that she'd been played for 4 years by man whose cruelty was so calculated it constituted art form. That evening, Elena left the estate for first time in months without Dante's explicit permission, her departure disguised as trip to visit her mother at the facility where Dante had arranged for her family to be housed after their initial imprisonment. But instead of going to see parents she was only permitted to visit under strict supervision, Elena went to the only place she could think of where the rules of her normal life didn't apply, a bar in part of the city where nobody knew her face or cared about the Moretti family's reputation. She'd never been much of a drinker before her marriage, her previous life too focused on work and family responsibilities to involve regular alcohol consumption. But tonight she ordered whiskey and drank it like medicine that might somehow numb the pain of realizing that 4 years of her life had been wasted on lies so cruel it transcended simple deception and became something closer to psychological torture. The whiskey burned going down, but she welcomed the sensation, welcomed anything that distracted from emotional devastation, making her hands shake and her vision blur with tears she refused to shed in public. "Rough day?" a voice asked from beside her, and Elena looked up to find a man who was attractive in ways that were completely different from Dante's cold aristocratic handsomeness, broad-shouldered and powerfully built, with features that suggested he'd grown up fighting for what he had rather than inheriting it, dark eyes that held genuine curiosity rather than calculated assessment. "Rough 4 years," Elena replied before she could stop herself, the whiskey apparently having compromised her usual careful control over what she said to strangers. Though today was particularly enlightening in terrible ways. "You can't complain," the stranger said, his smile suggesting he found her interesting rather than simply available. "Though I suspect your story is considerably more dramatic than mine. I'm Alessandro, by the way. And you're?" "Trying very hard not to think about who I am," Elena interrupted, because giving her real name to stranger in bar seemed like invitation to complications she didn't need. "Can we just not do names? Not do personal history? Just exist in this moment as two people who happen to end up drinking in the same place on the same night?" Alessandro studied her for a moment, his expression suggesting he was processing implications of her request and finding them intriguing rather than off-putting. "We can do that," he agreed. "No names. No history. Just two people having drinks and conversation that doesn't require explanations. Though I should warn you, I'm going to buy your next round whether you want me to or not, because you look like someone who needs kindness more than they need to maintain boundaries about accepting help from strangers." The conversation that followed was strange and liberating in equal measure, Elena finding herself talking to this man whose name she'd already forgotten about anything except the actual circumstances of her life, books she'd read, places she wished she could travel, opinions about art and music and whether pineapple belonged on pizza. He listened with attention that suggested genuine interest rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak, and his responses revealed intelligence that went beyond simple education to actual curiosity about the world. Somewhere around her fourth whiskey, Elena's judgment, already compromised by alcohol and emotional devastation, made decision that sober Elena would have recognized as catastrophically poor. "Do you want to get out of here?" she heard herself asking, the words emerging before conscious thought could stop them. "Go somewhere quieter? I don't want to be alone tonight. I don't want to think about my life or my choices or how I ended up where I am. I just want to feel something except disappointment in myself." Alessandro's expression suggested he understood exactly what she was offering and was conflicted about whether accepting was ethical given how obviously intoxicated she was. "Are you sure?" he asked carefully. "Because you seem like you're dealing with something heavy, and I don't want to be mistake you regret in the morning when clarity returns and you remember this seemed like good idea." "I'm sure," Elena lied because she wasn't sure about anything except that going back to Dante's house tonight felt impossible and staying alone felt worse. "Please, just be kind to me. That's all I'm asking. One night where someone treats me like I matter for reasons beyond what I can provide them. Can you do that?" "I can do that," Alessandro replied quietly, his hand gentle on her elbow as he helped her stand despite the whiskey making her balance questionable. "Come on. My hotel isn't far. We'll go there and I promise, whatever happens or doesn't happen you'll be safe. That's my guarantee." The hotel was expensive in ways that suggested Alessandro wasn't simply ordinary businessman despite his lack of aristocratic pretension. The suite he led her to occupying entire floor with views that probably cost more per night than Elena had earned in month at her previous job. But she barely registered the luxury, her attention focused on man who was looking at her with combination of desire and concern that suggested he was genuinely conflicted about whether this was good idea. "Last chance to change your mind," Alessandro said, his hands framing her face with touch that was gentle despite his obvious strength. "I can call you a car. Send you home. We can pretend this conversation never happened and you never have to see me again. But if you stay, if we do this, I need you to be certain it's what you actually want rather than just escape from whatever you're dealing with." "I want this," Elena whispered, and in that moment she meant it despite knowing mourning would bring regret and complications she wasn't prepared to handle. "Please, make me forget. Just for tonight. Make me feel like person instead of property." What followed was intense and surprisingly tender, Alessandro apparently having meant his promise about being kind because his touch carried care that Elena hadn't experienced in years of being treated as object rather than person. He took his time despite her attempts to rush, his attention focused entirely on her pleasure rather than simply his own satisfaction. And when they finally came together it felt less like transaction and more like genuine connection between two people who needed each other in that specific moment. Afterward, they lay tangled together while city lights painted patterns across the suite's expensive linens, and Elena felt something in her chest crack open that had been carefully guarded since the day she'd married Dante. "Thank you," she whispered against Alessandro's shoulder. "For being kind. For treating me like I mattered. I needed that more than you probably realize." "You do matter," Alessandro replied, his arms tightening around her. "Whatever you're dealing with, whoever made you believe otherwise, they're wrong. You matter. Remember that." Elena fell asleep in stranger's arms, her mind blissfully quiet for first time in years, her body relaxed in ways that medication and meditation had never accomplished. She didn't hear Alessandro leave the bed hours later, didn't register him standing at the window making phone calls in language she wouldn't have understood anyway, didn't know that the man she'd assumed was simply kind stranger was actually Alessandro Dante Romano, the crown prince of the most powerful crime family in Europe, whose reputation for ruthless efficiency made even the Morettas nervous about crossing him. She woke alone as dawn painted the suite in shades of rose and gold, Alessandro's side of the bed cold enough to suggest he'd been gone for hours. Panic hit immediately, the reality of what she'd done crashing over her with force that made her stomach turn. She'd cheated on her husband. Had spent night with stranger whose name she barely remembered. Had violated the terms of her imprisonment in ways that would definitely have consequences if Dante discovered her transgression. Elena dressed with shaking hands, her clothes from the previous night feeling wrong against skin that smelled like Alessandro's cologne and betrayal. She left the hotel without looking back, her mind already constructing explanations for where she'd been that might minimize Dante's rage when he discovered her absence. Reality was waiting at home in form of husband whose expression suggested he knew exactly where she'd been and what she'd done despite having no actual evidence beyond her overnight absence. "Where were you?" Dante asked with dangerous calm, his body blocking her path as Elena tried to escape to her bedroom without confrontation. "I went to see my mother," Elena lied, her voice steadier than she'd expected given the terror making her hands shake. "The visit went longer than anticipated. I should have called. I'm sorry." "You're lying," Dante replied pleasantly, his hand shooting out to grab her arm with grip that would definitely leave bruises tomorrow. "I called the facility. Your mother wasn't visited by anyone yesterday. Which means you were somewhere else. Doing something else. And I'm very curious what could have been important enough that you'd risk violating the terms of your sentence by disappearing without permission." The beating that followed was worse than any she'd experienced in 4 years of marriage, Dante's rage at her perceived betrayal overriding his usual careful control about not leaving marks visible to outsiders. Elena endured it in silence, her mind disconnecting from her body the way it had learned to do during the worst moments, her consciousness floating somewhere above the scene while physical pain happened to someone else entirely. When it was finally over, when Dante had exhausted his fury and left her bleeding on the expensive carpet, Elena lay still trying to remember why survival was preferable to simply giving up. Her family, her mind supplied weakly. "You're enduring this for your family. They need you to last until circumstances change enough that freedom becomes possible." But freedom felt like fantasy from fairy tale, and Elena was starting to suspect that fairy tales lied about happy endings being available to women whose mistakes had condemned them to permanent suffering. 2 months later, Elena stood in the bathroom of the Moretti estate staring at pregnancy tests that showed two pink lines with the kind of distinct clarity that left no room for interpretation. Pregnant. She was pregnant. Which should have been impossible given Dante's vasectomy, which meant the night at the hotel. The stranger whose name she'd deliberately not remembered. Alessandro's kindness and care and the connection she'd felt despite knowing they'd never see each other again. He'd gotten her pregnant. Had given her the child Dante had been demanding for 4 years while ensuring through surgical intervention that conception would never happen. Elena's first instinct was terror, the recognition that Dante would know immediately that the child couldn't be his, that her pregnancy would expose her infidelity in ways that would definitely result in consequences far worse than simple beating. But underneath the terror was something else, hope, fragile and dangerous, that maybe this child represented escape route she hadn't known existed. Maybe this pregnancy changed the equation enough that the rules of her sentence no longer applied. She was still processing implications when she heard her phone ring, the number unfamiliar but the area code suggesting local call. Hello? Elena answered cautiously, her free hand pressed against her still flat stomach in unconscious protective gesture. I've been looking for you, Alessandro's voice said, and Elena's breath caught with recognition that transcended simple memory of one night together. For 2 months I've been searching for the woman I met at that bar. The one who wouldn't give me her name. The one who disappeared before I could ask if she was okay. And today I finally found you, Elena Rossi. Wife of Dante Moretti. Mother of my child. We need to talk. The world tilted sideways as Elena processed that the stranger from that night wasn't simply kind man who'd happened to be in right place at right time. He was someone with resources to track her down, with interest in finding her that went beyond simple curiosity, with knowledge about her pregnancy that suggested he'd been monitoring her more carefully than she'd realized. I don't know what you're talking about, Elena said weakly, but the lie was transparent even to her own ears. Yes, you do, Alessandro replied gently. And Elena, I'm not calling to threaten you or complicate your life further than it's already complicated. I'm calling because that child you're carrying is mine, which makes you mine. And nobody, his voice hardened. Nobody gets to hurt what belongs to me. We're going to fix this situation. Together. Trust me. I can't, Elena whispered, but she was already wondering if maybe, just maybe, Alessandro Romano's unexpected reappearance in her life represented the miracle she'd stopped believing in. The one that might finally set her free. The call from Alessandro had ended with Elena promising to meet him the following day at location he'd specified. A cafe in neutral territory where neither Dante's surveillance nor Alessandro's reputation would draw unwanted attention. She'd spent the night lying awake trying to process that the kind stranger from her moment of reckless escape was apparently someone powerful enough to track her down despite her having given him no identifying information. Someone interested enough in their brief encounter to spend 2 months searching for woman whose real name he hadn't known. The cafe when Elena arrived was exactly the kind of place where people went when they wanted to have conversations they couldn't have in public. Small and tucked into alley that most tourists would miss, frequented by locals who understood that what happened at these tables stayed confidential. Alessandro was already there when she entered, his presence somehow dominating the space despite his relaxed posture, and Elena felt her breath catch with recognition that sober assessment of him was even more overwhelming than drunk impression had been. He was dangerous. That much was immediately clear from the way other patrons gave him unconscious wide berth, from the deference shown by staff who served his coffee, from the barely concealed security personnel positioned strategically around the cafe's perimeter. This wasn't simply wealthy businessman or even high-ranking criminal. This was apex predator whose territory included significant portion of the city, whose reputation made even powerful families like the Morettis nervous about direct confrontation. Thank you for coming, Alessandro said as Elena slid into the chair across from him, his voice gentle despite the intensity of his attention. I wasn't certain you would. Most women in your position would have changed their number and pretended this conversation wasn't going to happen. Most women in my position probably have more options than I do, Elena replied, her hands wrapping around the coffee cup that appeared in front of her without her having ordered. You said you've been looking for me for 2 months. That you know about, she gestured vaguely at her still flat stomach. About the pregnancy. I need to know how you know that. And why you care. Because Alessandro, she met his eyes directly. That night was mistake born from too much alcohol and too much pain in circumstances you don't understand. It doesn't create obligation. It doesn't mean you're responsible for consequences. I can handle this alone. Can you? Alessandro's voice carried skepticism that was gentle but unmistakable. Because from what I've learned about your situation in the past 2 months, and Elena, I've learned quite a bit once I had your actual name to work with, you're currently imprisoned by a man who's been systematically destroying you for 4 years. You're married to someone who has no intention of ever releasing your family regardless of what you do. You're trapped in cage disguised as luxury home with no resources and no support system beyond guards who report your every movement. So forgive me for questioning whether handling this alone is actually a viable option versus simply what you've been conditioned to say when offered help. The accuracy of his assessment made Elena's careful composure crack slightly, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes despite her best efforts to maintain dignity. "What do you want from me?" she asked quietly. "Why go to all this trouble to find me? Why care about woman you met once in bar and never expected to see again? This doesn't make sense, Alessandro. People like you don't rescue people like me unless there's something in it for you." "The child is mine," Alessandro replied simply, his hand reaching across the table to cover hers. "That's not speculation or possibility. I had your medical records obtained from the hospital where you were treated last week. The conception date matches our night together. Which means the baby you're carrying is mine. My blood. My legacy. And Elena, nobody gets to hurt my blood. Not your husband. Not his family. Not anyone. That's why I care. That's what's in it for me beyond simple altruism." The possessiveness in his voice should have been alarming, but instead Elena found it oddly comforting. The recognition that someone actually viewed her pregnancy as valuable rather than evidence of failure or betrayal. "Dante's going to know the baby isn't his," she said, voicing the fear that had been consuming her since seeing those 2 pink lines. "He had vasectomy. He can't have children. The moment I tell him I'm pregnant, he'll know I cheated." And then, she stopped, unable to articulate exactly what Dante would do but certain it would be catastrophic. "Then he'll have to deal with me," Alessandro said with calm certainty that suggested this was an empty threat. "And Elena, trust me when I say that Dante Moretti is considerably less confident when facing actual opposition versus terrorizing woman who has no resources to fight back. I'm giving you choice right now. Stay in your current situation and try to manage pregnancy while trapped with man who will absolutely hurt you and the child once he discovers the truth. Or come with me. Let me protect you both. Let me be father my child deserves rather than letting him be raised believing he's Moretti heir." "I can't," Elena protested, but her voice lacked conviction because the offer was seductive in ways that went beyond simple safety. "My family is still imprisoned. If I leave Dante, if I violate the terms of our arrangement, they'll never be released. He'll make sure they suffer for my defiance. I can't abandon them just because I finally have chance at freedom. Your family," Alessandro said carefully, "is being held at facility that I control. It's one of my operations, leased to the Morettis as favor several years ago. Which means if I decide your parents and siblings are free to leave, they're free to leave. Dante has no actual authority over their imprisonment beyond my willingness to continue the arrangement. So Elena, that's not obstacle. That's solved problem waiting for you to accept the solution." The information crashed over Elena with force that made her dizzy, the recognition that the prison holding her family hostage was actually controlled by man sitting across from her offering rescue. This whole time you've owned the place where they're being kept? And you're only mentioning this now? What if I'd refused to meet you? What if I'd decided staying with Dante was safer option? Would you have just let them continue suffering?" "No," Alessandro replied honestly. "If you'd refused to meet me, I would have freed them anyway and arranged for your extraction whether you wanted it or not. But I prefer you choosing this rather than me forcing it. Makes the morality slightly less questionable if you're actively participating in your own rescue." It should have been alarming, his casual admission that he'd been prepared to essentially kidnap her if she hadn't cooperated, but Elena was too exhausted by years of captivity to care much about the ethics of how freedom was achieved. "What happens if I agree?" she asked quietly. "If I let you take me away from Dante? What does my life look like after?" "Protected," Alessandro said immediately. "You and the child both. I have a state where you'll be safe while we arrange permanent solution to the Dante problem. You'll have medical care appropriate for high-risk pregnancy given the stress you've been under. You'll have resources to rebuild life that doesn't involve being anyone's prisoner. And when the baby is born," his voice softened, "you'll have partner in raising him. Not owner. Not jailer. Partner who actually values you for reasons beyond what you can provide." It was everything Elena had fantasized about during 4 years of suffering. Rescue offered without strings that would simply create new cage, protection that came from genuine care rather than calculated control, chance at life that belonged to her rather than being dictated by man who enjoyed her misery. It was too good to be true, which meant it probably was, but Elena found she didn't care about probability when the alternative was returning to Dante's house and trying to hide pregnancy from husband who would definitely kill her once he discovered her betrayal. "Okay," she heard herself saying, the word emerging before conscious thought could stop it. "I'll come with you. I'll let you protect me and the baby." "But Alessandro," she met his eyes directly. "If this turns out to be another cage disguised as freedom, if you turn out to be simply different version of Dante who wants ownership rather than partnership, I will find way to leave. I'm done being property. Done being controlled. If you're offering genuine freedom, I accept. But I won't trade one prison for another just because the new cell comes with better amenities." "Fair terms," Alessandro agreed, his smile suggesting genuine respect for her boundary setting. "I promise, no cages. No ownership. Just protection until you're strong enough that you don't need anyone's help to maintain your freedom. That's my guarantee." The extraction happened that night with efficiency that suggested Alessandro's organization had been planning it for considerably longer than their conversation would have implied. Elena was collected from the Moretti estate under pretense of medical emergency requiring immediate hospitalization, the ambulance that arrived containing actual medical personnel along with Alessandro's security team. Dante had attempted to accompany her, his possessive instincts apparently overriding his disgust for her perceived inadequacy, but Alessandro's people had been politely firm about hospital policy limiting visitors during emergency procedures. By the time Dante realized Elena wasn't actually at the hospital he'd been directed to, by the time he understood that his wife had been extracted rather than simply treated, Elena was already secure in Alessandro's primary residence. A fortress disguised as luxury estate, its security systems sophisticated enough that even the Moretti family's resources wouldn't be sufficient to breach the defenses. "Your family arrived an hour ago," Alessandro informed Elena as he showed her to a suite that was somehow both more luxurious and more comfortable than anything in Dante's house. "They're being settled in guest quarters on the east wing. Your mother cried for approximately 20 minutes when I told her you were safe. Your father appears to be in shock but handling the transition well given he spent 4 years believing rescue was impossible. Your siblings are mostly just excited about having access to decent food again." The casual way he delivered this information, like freeing imprisoned family, was simply item on checklist rather than miracle Elena had stopped believing would ever happen, made her throat tighten with emotions she'd been suppressing for years. "Thank you," she managed, her voice breaking despite attempts to maintain composure. For all of this. For finding me. For caring about stranger you met in bar. She stopped, unable to articulate exactly what his intervention meant because gratitude felt inadequate for describing the magnitude of what he'd given her. "You're not stranger," Alessandro replied gently, his hand settling on her shoulder with touch that was comforting without being possessive. "You're the mother of my child. That creates connection that goes beyond one night of comfort during crisis. And Elena, I keep what's mine. Always. No one touches my family. No one hurts my blood. Dante's going to learn that lesson very soon. But for now, rest. Recover. Let yourself actually heal instead of just surviving. Everything else can wait until you're strong enough to face it." The first week at Alessandro's estate passed in surreal suspension of normal reality, Elena slowly adjusting to life where her needs were actually considered rather than simply being backdrop to someone else's cruelty. She was examined by actual medical professionals who expressed alarm at the evidence of long-term physical abuse, who treated her injuries with care that Dante's doctors had never bothered providing, who prescribed rest and nutrition and absence of stress as if those were reasonable things to expect rather than impossible luxuries. Her family's presence helped ground her, the reunion with her parents and siblings providing anchors to reality that made the entire situation feel less like dream that would evaporate when she woke. Her mother cried every time she saw Elena, her grief at years of separation apparently requiring constant expression, while her father remained quiet and watchful in ways that suggested he was processing trauma that wouldn't heal quickly. Her siblings, now teenagers rather than the children she remembered, treated the entire thing like adventure they were lucky to be part of, their resilience in the face of 4 years' imprisonment somehow making Elena feel worse about having been unable to free them sooner. But the real adjustment was Alessandro himself, his presence in her daily life both comforting and complicated in ways Elena hadn't anticipated. He was attentive without being controlling, checking on her frequently enough that she felt protected but not so constantly that it became suffocating. He discussed plans for addressing the Dante situation with her rather than simply deciding unilaterally what should happen, his respect for her autonomy suggesting genuine partnership rather than simply different form of ownership. And he spoke about the pregnancy with combination of wonder and protectiveness that made Elena's chest ache with recognition that this was what fatherhood was supposed to look like. Engaged, caring, genuinely invested in the child's welfare rather than simply viewing offspring as status symbol. "I've been thinking about names," Alessandro said one evening as they sat in the estate's library, Elena's growing comfort with his presence having progressed to the point where shared silence felt peaceful rather than awkward. "If it's a boy, which preliminary genetic testing suggests it is, I was thinking perhaps Leonardo. My grandfather's name. Though obviously you have equal say in this decision. Probably more than equal say given you're the one actually gestating him." Leonardo Romano. Elena tested the name on her tongue and found she liked how it sounded. "It's good. Strong. Though I should warn you, I have absolutely no idea how to be mother. I spent 4 years being told I was inadequate at the one thing women were supposedly designed to do, and now I'm supposed to actually raise child when I've never even held baby before. That seems like recipe for spectacular failure." "Then we'll fail spectacularly together," Alessandro replied with confidence that suggested he had no doubts about their combined abilities. "Neither of us has done this before. We'll figure it out as we go. Make mistakes and correct them. Learn what works and what doesn't. That's called parenting apparently." "And Elena?" His hand covered hers. "You're not inadequate. You never were. Dante deliberately created situation where you'd believe yourself to be failing at impossible task. That's not reflection of your abilities. That's reflection of his cruelty." The validation was medicine Elena hadn't realized she needed. The recognition that 4 years of being told she was worthless hadn't actually changed her fundamental value as person. She was still processing this revelation when Alessandro's phone rang with tone that apparently indicated emergency requiring immediate attention. His expression when he looked at the screen made Elena's stomach clench with premonition that whatever news he'd just received was significant. "It's about Dante," Alessandro said quietly, his voice carrying carefully controlled anger. "My people have been monitoring the Moretti estate. Your husband just attempted to assault one of my security personnel who was conducting surveillance. He's apparently decided that if he can't have you back, he'll settle for hurting anyone associated with your rescue. That changes the timeline significantly." "What do you mean?" Elena asked, though she suspected she knew exactly what Alessandro meant and was simply hoping she was wrong about the implications. "I mean," Alessandro replied, his voice hardening into something that made Elena remember exactly what kind of man he was beneath the gentleness he showed her, "that Dante Moretti has just moved from problem I was planning to address eventually to threat I'm eliminating immediately. He's not going to hurt anyone else. Not my people. Definitely not you or our child. And not your family. His reign of terror ends tonight. Permanently." The declaration should have alarmed Elena. The casual way Alessandro announced he was essentially planning murder should have triggered moral objections about violence and legal consequences. But instead she found herself simply relieved, grateful that someone was finally treating Dante's cruelty as something requiring decisive action rather than simply circumstance to be endured until circumstances changed. "What are you going to do?" she asked quietly. "What needs to be done?" Alessandro replied. "Justice that the legal system wouldn't provide because the Morettis own too many judges. Protection that you should have received 4 years ago when Dante's brother attacked you. Closure that will let you actually move forward instead of constantly looking over your shoulder waiting for him to find way to hurt you again. Don't worry about the details, Elena. Just know that by morning you'll be free. Actually free. Not just temporarily safe but permanently liberated from the man who's been destroying you." The operation, because that's what Alessandro's people called it, with the kind of clinical detachment that came from conducting violent business with professional efficiency, unfolded over the course of a single night that Elena spent trying not to think too carefully about what was happening while Alessandro was away from the estate. She didn't need to know specifics. Didn't want to carry detailed knowledge of exactly how Dante's empire was being dismantled or what methods were being employed to ensure he could never threaten her family again. What she learned in the morning, delivered by Alessandro with the kind of careful gentleness that suggested he knew the information would be complicated for her to process, reshaped her entire understanding of the past 4 years and her place within the Moretti family's schemes. "Dante's being arrested as we speak," Alessandro said, his hand gentle on her shoulder as they stood together watching news coverage of spectacular fall from grace. "Federal charges for international drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, human trafficking, conspiracy to commit fraud, the list is extensive. My people provided evidence to authorities that couldn't be ignored even by judges on his payroll. He's going to prison for a very long time. Possibly forever if prosecutors are as competent as they should be given the case I've handed them. And Marco? Elena asked, because her original attacker's absence from the morning's revelations felt conspicuous. Dante's brother, the one who attacked me, whose supposed death was reason I was forced into this marriage in the first place? Alessandro's expression shifted to something that held both fury and satisfaction. Marco Moretti is alive, he said quietly. Has been alive this entire time. The attack you witnessed wasn't meant to kill you, it was meant to traumatize you enough that you'd accept marriage as preferable to legal prosecution. And his supposed death, the reason your family was imprisoned unless you married Dante, completely fabricated. Marco's been living quite comfortably in another country, his death, simply convenient fiction the Morettis created to give them leverage over you. Your entire imprisonment was based on lie, Elena. You suffered for 4 years because they wanted to own you, and creating elaborate tragedy was apparently entertaining way to accomplish that. The information hit Elena like physical blow, her knees going weak enough that Alessandro had to steady her to prevent her from collapsing entirely. 4 years. 4 years of suffering based on complete fabrication, of believing she'd killed someone and owed debt that required her entire life as payment, of enduring Dante's cruelty because she thought it was punishment she deserved for defending herself. All of it, every moment of pain, every instance of degradation, every tear she'd cried believing herself guilty, all of it had been manufactured by people who decided her autonomy was less important than their entertainment. My father, Elena whispered, her voice breaking as the full weight of implications crashed over her. My father, he was in the facility when he was freed. Was he? Did he? He passed away 2 days ago, Alessandro said gently, his arms coming around her as she started to shake. Heart failure. The doctors said years of stress had weakened him beyond what his body could sustain. I'm sorry, Elena. I know that's not what you wanted to hear. But your mother and siblings are safe. And your father's death, while tragic, means he at least died knowing you were finally free. That has to count for something. It counted for everything and nothing simultaneously. The knowledge that her father had experienced freedom before dying somehow making his death both better and worse. The recognition that he'd endured 4 years of imprisonment for crime that hadn't actually occurred making his suffering retroactively meaningless. Elena sobbed against Alessandro's chest while he held her, his presence steady anchor while her world realigned itself around truths that changed everything she'd believed about her culpability and her circumstances. When the grief finally subsided enough for coherent thought, when Elena could breathe without feeling like her chest was being crushed, she found herself asking the question she'd been avoiding since accepting Alessandro's protection. Why, she whispered. Why go to all this trouble for woman you met once? For child who wasn't planned or expected? What do you actually want from me, Alessandro? Because nobody rescues people out of simple altruism. Nobody destroys powerful families just because they think it's right thing to do. So what's your angle? What are you getting from this besides child you didn't ask for? Alessandro was quiet for a long moment, his hand stroking her hair with gentleness that suggested he was choosing his words carefully. You want the truth? He asked finally. The real answer instead of comforting fiction? I'm selfish bastard who sees something he wants and takes it regardless of whether that's morally acceptable. I wanted you from the moment I met you in that bar, wanted your strength, your resilience, your refusal to be completely broken despite obviously dealing with circumstances that would have destroyed most people. And then I learned you were carrying my child, and wanting you transformed into needing you. Because Elena, I don't share. I don't compromise on things that belong to me. You're mine now. The baby is mine. And I will burn down anyone who tries to take what's mine. That's my angle. That's what I'm getting from this. Permanently. The possessiveness in his voice should have terrified her, but instead Elena found it oddly comforting, the recognition that someone actually valued her enough to be proprietary rather than simply viewing her as disposable property to be used and discarded. It was different from Dante's ownership, which had been about control for its own sake. Alessandro's claiming felt like it came from actual caring rather than simply desire to dominate. I'm not property, Elena said quietly, testing his reaction to boundary setting. I appreciate the rescue. I'm grateful for the protection. But I won't trade one cage for another just because the new owner is more attractive and marginally less cruel. If you want me to stay, if you want to build something real, it has to be partnership. Not ownership. Can you do that? I can try, Alessandro replied honestly. My instincts are toward possession rather than partnership. But Elena, you're worth learning better habits for. So yes, we'll figure out how to build something that doesn't involve me treating you like acquisition I've claimed. But fair warning, I'm probably going to fail occasionally. Be possessive when I shouldn't be. Overprotective in ways that feel controlling. When that happens, tell me. Correct me. I'll listen even if my initial instinct is to argue. That's my promise. It wasn't perfect guarantee of healthy relationship, but it was honest recognition of his limitations combined with commitment to try overcoming them. That felt like foundation they could actually build on rather than simply pretty lies that would crumble under stress. Okay, Elena said finally. Let's try. Partnership instead of ownership. Father and mother raising child together rather than jailer and prisoner. And Alessandro, she looked up at him directly. Thank you. For freeing me. For destroying the people who hurt me. For giving me chance at actual life instead of just survival. I know I haven't said it enough, but thank you. You're welcome, Alessandro murmured, and kissed her with intensity that suggested he'd been waiting for permission to do exactly that since the moment she'd arrived at his estate. They'd figure out the details later, how to actually build relationship from crisis and pregnancy, how to raise child together when they barely knew each other, how to navigate his world and her trauma and the complicated logistics of merging their lives. But for now, Elena was free. Actually, genuinely free for first time in 4 years. And that was miracle enough to make all the complications feel manageable. The months following Dante's arrest passed in strange suspension between Elena's old life and the new one she was slowly constructing with Alessandro's help, the pregnancy progressing with the kind of textbook normalcy that doctors kept commenting on with surprise given the stress she'd been under for past 4 years. Alessandro was involved in ways that went beyond simple financial provision, attending every appointment, reading the parenting books Elena had started collecting with combination of genuine interest and amusing confusion about some of the recommendations, asking questions that suggested he was actually trying to understand what was happening rather than simply going through motions of expected involvement. The book says we should play classical music for the baby, Alessandro observed one evening, his hand resting on Elena's increasingly prominent stomach with the kind of reverent attention that still made her breath catch. Claims it promotes cognitive development or something. Though I suspect that pseudoscience designed to make anxious parents spend money on unnecessary products. What do you think? Should we be concerned about our child's prenatal musical education? I think, Elena replied with amusement that had been increasingly present as her body healed and her mind slowly accepted that freedom was permanent rather than temporary, that you're taking the parenting preparation more seriously than necessary given the baby can't even hear properly yet. But it's sweet that you're worried about his cognitive development before he's born. Very type A of you. I'm not type A, Alessandro protested, though his expression suggested he recognized the accuracy of her assessment. I'm appropriately thorough about important matters. There's difference between being controlling and being invested. Keep telling yourself that, Elena said, her smile taking the sting out of the observation. Though I appreciate the investment even when it tips into ridiculousness. You're going to be good father, Alessandro. Possibly overprotective and definitely paranoid about every possible threat, but genuinely caring in ways that matter more than technical perfection. The reassurance seemed to mean something to him, his expression softening in ways that suggested he'd been carrying concerns about his adequacy that matched Elena's own worries. I hope so, he said quietly. My own father wasn't exactly model parent. More interested in grooming heir to criminal empire than actually connecting with his children as people. I'm trying very hard not to repeat those patterns. To actually know our son rather than simply training him to fill role I've predetermined. That's goal anyway. Their relationship had been developing parallel to the pregnancy, physical intimacy gradually following emotional connection as Elena's trauma began healing enough that touch no longer triggered panic responses. Alessandro was patient in ways that suggested genuine care rather than simply strategic manipulation, his attention focused on Elena's comfort and pleasure rather than his own satisfaction, and the first time they'd made love after she'd moved into his estate had felt like claiming that was mutual rather than one-sided. But the domestic tranquility was disrupted when Dante, out on bail pending trial through legal maneuvering that shouldn't have been possible but apparently was when you had resources to exploit every loophole, made his final, catastrophic mistake. He'd appeared at Alessandro's estate gates demanding Elena's return, his presence violating multiple restraining orders and triggering security protocols that had Alessandro's entire organization mobilized within minutes. You can't keep her, Dante had shouted at the security cameras, his voice carrying the kind of entitled rage that came from never having faced real consequences before. She's my wife. That child is mine. You've stolen my property and I want it returned immediately or I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of criminal you are, Romano. I'll expose your entire operation. Destroy your legitimate businesses. Make sure you spend the rest of your life in prison just like you're trying to do to me. The threats were empty. Dante had no actual evidence about Alessandro's operations that wasn't already known to authorities who decided his legitimate businesses were valuable enough to overlook his less legal activities, but they were also violation of terms that Alessandro had been very clear about. Elena was under his protection. Threatening her meant threatening him. And nobody threatened Alessandro Romano without facing consequences that would make them regret having survived the encounter. Stay inside, Alessandro instructed Elena, his voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that suggested Dante had just made terminal error in judgment. Don't come out regardless of what you hear. Promise me, Elena. I need to know you and the baby are safe before I handle this. Handle this how? Elena asked, though she suspected she knew exactly what Alessandro meant and was simply hoping she was wrong. Alessandro, he's out on bail. There are legal processes. If you hurt him now, if you do something that compromises the case against him. The case is airtight, Alessandro interrupted. Multiple federal charges with evidence that can't be dismissed or explained away. Whether Dante lives or dies has no impact on his legal consequences. But him showing up here, threatening you, violating restraining orders that were specifically designed to keep him away from you, that's different problem requiring different solution. Trust me to handle it. Please. Elena wanted to argue, wanted to insist that legal system should be allowed to do its job rather than Alessandro taking justice into his own hands, but she was also pragmatic enough to recognize that Dante wouldn't stop with this confrontation. He'd keep coming, keep threatening, keep finding ways to make her life hell because that's what he did. He destroyed women who dared to escape his control. Letting Alessandro handle it permanently, while morally questionable, was probably the only way she'd ever actually be safe. Okay, she agreed quietly. I trust you. Just be careful. Please. Our son needs his father to survive whatever happens in the next hour. Alessandro kissed her once, hard, desperate, possessive, and then he was gone, moving toward the estate gates with his security team flanking him. Elena stayed inside as instructed, her hands pressed against her stomach in unconscious protective gesture while she tried not to imagine exactly what was happening beyond the walls that separated her from confrontation unfolding. The confrontation itself was brief and brutal, Alessandro's patience for Dante's entitled rage having been exhausted months ago when he'd learned exactly what Elena had endured during their marriage. You're trespassing, Alessandro said with dangerous calm. Violating restraining orders. Threatening woman under my protection. That's 3 capital offenses in my world. Normally I'd give you chance to apologize and retreat. But Dante, his voice hardened. You tortured her. Deliberately prevented her from getting pregnant while blaming her for infertility you'd created. Kept her family imprisoned for 4 years based on lies about your brother's death. You're not getting apology opportunity. You're getting exactly what you deserve. What followed was execution disguised as self-defense. Dante's decision to pull weapon making Alessandro's response legally justified even if the outcome had been predetermined regardless of what Dante actually did. The body was dealt with through channels that ensured it would never be found, the official story being that Dante had violated bail conditions and fled the country to avoid prosecution. And by the time authorities finished their investigation into his disappearance, Elena's pregnancy had progressed enough that she was focused entirely on preparing for Leonardo's arrival rather than processing complicated feelings about her former captor's death. I should feel guilty, Elena admitted to Alessandro one evening a week after Dante's disappearance, her conscience apparently deciding that the appropriate emotional response to her husband's murder should include some remorse despite recognizing he deserved exactly what he'd gotten. He was a terrible person who did terrible things, but he was still a human being whose death I'm at least partially responsible for. I should feel something beyond relief that he's gone. You feel what you feel, Alessandro replied pragmatically. If relief is your primary emotion, that's valid response to threat being permanently eliminated. You're not required to mourn man who spent 4 years torturing you simply because he died. Guilt is for people who've done something wrong. You haven't. You've simply survived someone who was determined to destroy you. The reassurance helped, though Elena suspected she'd spend significant time in therapy eventually processing exactly how she felt about all of this. But that was a problem for future Elena to address. Present Elena was focused on the fact that she was 7 months pregnant, finally free from the man who'd imprisoned her, and building life with someone who actually seemed to value her for reasons beyond what she could provide him. Leonardo's birth 2 months later was simultaneously terrifying and transcendent, Elena's body apparently having decided to make up for 4 years of being unable to conceive by making the actual delivery as dramatic as possible. Alessandro had been present throughout despite Elena's initial protests that he didn't need to witness the horror of childbirth, his hand in hers providing anchor during contractions that made her certain she was dying, his voice talking her through the pushing when her body insisted it couldn't possibly do this anymore. And then, a cry. Strong and angry and absolutely perfect. Their son, screaming his displeasure at being removed from warm comfortable space and thrust into harsh lights and cold air, his tiny fists waving with indignation that made both parents laugh despite exhaustion. "He's beautiful," Alessandro whispered, his voice rough with emotion Elena had never heard from him before. "He's perfect. You're perfect." "Elena?" He looked at her with expression that held wonder mixed with something deeper. "Thank you. For surviving long enough that we could have this. For being strong enough to create life despite everything trying to destroy you. His voice broke. For choosing me. For staying even when you had every reason to run. I love you. I should have said it sooner, but I love you. Completely. Permanently. You're not just mother of my child. You're everything." The confession was delivered with raw honesty that made Elena's chest ache despite exhaustion, making every muscle in her body scream protest at continued consciousness. "I love you too," she replied, because it was true and because she was tired of being careful about expressing feelings that had been growing since the moment he'd offered her freedom without conditions. "Even though you're overprotective and possessive and probably need therapy about your control issues. I love you anyway. Possibly because of those things rather than despite them. That probably says concerning things about my own psychological state, but I'm too tired to examine it right now." "We'll examine it later," Alessandro agreed, his attention already shifting to Leonardo, who'd been placed in Elena's arms and was currently staring at her with the kind of unfocused intensity that newborns seem to possess. "Right now we're just going to exist in this moment and appreciate that we somehow ended up here despite everything that should have prevented it. Our son. Our family. Our future. It's more than I deserve and exactly what I needed." The months following Leonardo's birth passed in exhausted blur of feeding schedules and diaper changes and gradually figuring out how to be parents to infant who seemed determined to never sleep for more than 2 consecutive hours. Elena's mother had moved in to help during the initial weeks, her presence providing both practical assistance and emotional support as Elena adjusted to motherhood while still processing 4 years of trauma that didn't simply disappear because circumstances had improved. But gradually, as Leonardo grew from fragile newborn into sturdy infant who smiled at his parents and started showing signs of personality that suggested he'd inherited Alessandro's determination and Elena's stubborn independence, Elena found herself actually relaxing into her new life. The fear that had been constant companion since marrying Dante finally began loosening its grip, replaced by something that felt almost like contentment, the recognition that she was safe, her family was safe, and the man she'd built this life with actually cared about her welfare rather than simply her utility. One evening when Leonardo was 6 months old and finally sleeping through most of the night, Alessandro found Elena in the estate's library where she'd been attempting to read but mostly just staring at the books while her mind wandered through processing everything that had changed in the past year. "I've been thinking," he said, settling onto the couch beside her with the kind of comfortable proximity that suggested he belonged in her space rather than invading it. "About the future. About what comes next for us beyond just raising Leonardo and dealing with the various criminal enterprises I'm supposedly running. Should I be concerned about where this is going?" Elena asked, though her tone suggested amusement rather than actual worry. "Because that preamble sounds suspiciously like you're about to propose something dramatic that will require me to make decisions about our relationship trajectory." "Possibly," Alessandro admitted with a smile that suggested he knew exactly what he was asking and had prepared for potential objections. "I want to marry you, Elena. Not because I'm trying to own you or because I think legal contract changes anything fundamental about our connection. But because I want to officially declare that you're my partner. My equal. The person I'm choosing to build life with rather than simply person circumstance threw into my path. And before you object about marriage having negative associations given your first experience with the institution, I promise this would be nothing like what you endured with Dante. This would be actual partnership. Mutual respect. Love instead of ownership. What do you think?" Elena's first instinct was panic, the mention of marriage triggering memories of silk prison and 4 years of suffering that had been legitimized through legal contract. But underneath the panic was something else, recognition that Alessandro was genuinely offering partnership rather than simply new form of captivity, that the man asking her to marry him was nothing like the one who'd tortured her, that saying yes wouldn't trap her but rather officially acknowledge what they'd already built together. "Yes," she heard herself saying, the word emerging with certainty that surprised even her. "I'll marry you. Not because I need legal validation of our relationship or because I think contract changes anything fundamental. But because I love you and I want to officially declare that I'm choosing you. Actively. Consciously. Not as survival strategy but as genuine emotional commitment. So yes. Let's do the dramatic thing and get married. The wedding, when it finally happened 3 months later, was intimate affair attended only by people who actually mattered. Elena's family, Alessandro's closest associates, Leonardo in his mother's arms wearing tiny suit that was probably unnecessarily expensive for 6-month-old who would definitely spit up on it. It was held at the estate where Elena had slowly learned that freedom was actual possibility rather than simply fantasy. The ceremony conducted by official who understood that sometimes legal recognition came after emotional commitment rather than before it. I, Alessandro Dante Romano, take you, Elena Rossi, to be my wife, Alessandro said, his voice carrying across the assembled witnesses with solemnity that suggested he understood the weight of what they were promising each other. To protect and cherish and give you freedom to make your own choices rather than dictating your existence. I promise to love you as partner rather than possession. To raise our son with you as equals rather than you simply supporting my parenting decisions. To never again be the kind of man who believes ownership is acceptable substitute for genuine connection. This is my vow. I, Elena Rossi, take you, Alessandro Romano, to be my husband, Elena replied, her voice steady despite tears threatening. To love and challenge and occasionally tell you when your protective instincts cross into controlling territory. I promise to trust you despite every lesson I learned about men and power and what happens when you give them access to your vulnerability. To build life with you that's chosen rather than imposed. To parent our son together as team rather than you making all decisions while I simply implement them. This is my vow. They were married in the library where Alessandro had proposed, bound not by ownership but by choice that transcended every complication that had brought them together. It was beginning built on crisis and pregnancy and rescue from imprisonment, relationship that probably shouldn't have worked given how it started but somehow had anyway. As Elena stood with her husband and their son, surrounded by family who'd survived their own imprisonment and started rebuilding lives that belonged to them rather than the Morettas, she found herself actually believing in happy endings, not the fairy tale version that glossed over complications, but the real kind that acknowledged trauma while refusing to be defined by it. She'd been sentenced to suffer. Had spent 4 years as prisoner in silk sheets, tortured by men who'd enjoyed her pain. But that wasn't where her story ended. That was simply darkness that made the light more precious when she'd finally found it. And the light, this life, this family, this man who'd destroyed her captors and given her freedom without expecting ownership in return, was worth every terrible moment that had led to it. Elena was free. Actually, genuinely, permanently free. And that was miracle worth celebrating regardless of how complicated the path to freedom had been. The end. Immerse yourself in more powerful romance. If A Wife Sentenced to Suffer resonated with your soul, subscribe for exclusive bonus content, extended epilogues revealing Elena and Alessandro's journey through Leonardo's childhood, deleted scenes of their developing trust during her pregnancy, and bonus chapters exploring the healing process after years of captivity. Explore the expanded universe. Discover other survivors of toxic relationships finding freedom and love, learn about Alessandro's organization protecting abused women, and find out what happens to Elena's family as they rebuild their lives. Join the community. Connect with readers who love powerful redemption arcs, protective heroes who actually respect boundaries, and heroines who survive trauma without losing their strength. Leave your review. Your feedback helps other readers discover stories of survival and hope, and helps us create more content featuring complex characters navigating healing and love. Coming soon. Romano Legacy, Leonardo's story as he grows up learning about his parents' complicated past. Chains broken. Stories of other women Alessandro's organization has freed from abusive situations. The Moretti Reckoning, what happens to Marco and the remaining family members. Stay connected for weekly updates, survivor resources, character deep dives, and discussions about healthy relationships after trauma. Subscribe now and never miss stories of women reclaiming their power. Thank you for witnessing Elena's journey from captivity to freedom. Your engagement means everything. May you always find the strength to escape what holds you captive, the courage to accept help when offered genuinely, and the wisdom to recognize the difference between protection and possession. Freedom is never given. It's taken. And it's worth fighting for.